Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CSPI podcast. I'm here today with David Bernstein. He is a law professor at George Mason University. Do you have any other titles or positions, David?
I am the executive director of the Liberty and Law Center at the Scalia Law School, which is the official name of the law school now at George Mason, and that's about it.
Uh-huh. Okay, great. And he is the author of a new book called Classified: The Untold Story of Racial Classification in America, which we're going to talk about. He's also written a book called You Can't Say That, about civil rights law and free speech. And so these are topics I've always been interested in. So look forward to talking. How did you get the idea of writing this book on racial classification? Because it's a pretty abstract topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some of my prior research, including for the You Can't Say That book and some of my other academic work, I came across the issue of racial classification. There's also a bunch of law professors who've written books about how classification was done historically and so forth. It was a big issue in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, whether someone who was seventh, eighth white could be segregated and classified as African American. It occurred to me, I can't pinpoint the moment, but it occurred to me that we still engage in these classifications. And as the country gets ever more diverse and there's ever more marriage among different ethnic groups, the categories get ever more arbitrary and sort of ridiculous. And I started looking into it just to see what would come of it. And I discovered that the classifications we have came about in a very haphazard and kind of arbitrary manner, which is not itself surprising, but just how poorly defined the categories are and just how little thought went into them was actually a little bit surprising.
Yeah, so we have some listeners who are not Americans, and even Americans probably don't know the story. Although Americans are used to filling out forms, and then they know that when you fill out a form for you're taking a test in school or you're applying for a job, it has a race question, it has an ethnicity question. So, what are the racial categories in America, and how did we get here in a nutshell?
Okay, so let's start off with the fact that I think most Americans, maybe including me before I really started researching it, think that racial classification is purely a matter of self identification. So you get a form, whether it's to apply to college or fill out or to apply for a mortgage or to ask for a green card or a whole bunch of other things that we do in American life, and you're asked to click off what your race or ethnicity is. And they don't usually give you much in the way of definitions. So you just sort of check the box you feel most fits you. And what we don't realize is that these categories come from the federal government, and they do actually have official definitions, even if they're not always expressed. So we have African American / Black. We have Native American or American Indian. We have Hispanic Latino, white, Asian American, and Pacific Islander / Native Hawaiian. And then separately, you're asked whether you are of Hispanic ethnicity or not.
Yeah. So you can be Hispanic ethnicity and you can be any race. You can be black, white, Asian. You said it's not self. It depends on the circumstance, doesn't it? Because you have court cases in the book where somebody will be trying to get a some kind of small business loan, but then like when you apply to college and you check a box, there's no verification there, is there?
No, I mean, so we're in kind of a weird situation where there are official, legally binding definitions that institutions are supposed to use, but the institutions themselves rarely provide those definitions to people who are filling out the forms, and thus they obviously can't say that you committed any kind of fraud or anything if you filled out something because they don't tell you what the definition is. So in practice, in fact, people can usually identify however they want, but there are occasions, as you discussed, there are cases in the book where the government does come back and say, "Wait a second, your name is John Smith, but you filled out that you're Hispanic. That doesn't sound very Hispanic to us. Could you tell us what makes you consider yourself Hispanic?" And John Smith may say, for example, "Well, my grandfather was born in Cuba and came to the United States." And then the agency in question has to adjudicate whether you are in fact Hispanic and therefore eligible for affirmative action preferences or not.
Yeah. So government. I mean, before the civil rights era, the federal government. How did it think about race, and how did that change? Say before the mid 1960s and after.
So we have to remember that for the most part, the population of the United States was categorized either as white or black. That was like 99% of the population. What we now refer to as Hispanic or Latinos as an ethnicity, they were generally considered white unless they were obviously black or otherwise. So we had blacks and whites, and then we had a very small group of Asians who weren't usually classified specifically as Asian, but were classified as either Japanese, Chinese, or Filipino American, or occasionally something else. But those were the three big groups. There were Native Americans or American Indians, but they were considered, a sort of a separate category of themselves, because most of them who self-identified as Indians at that time lived on reservations, and they were sort of autonomous. And there was, of course, no Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander category. So basically, for the most part, we had whites and Negroes in the terminology of the day, or later blacks, and we had a couple of small Asian groups and maybe others. But for the most part, you're either white or black. That's what it came down to.
Yeah. And so, yeah. And what would the federal government? I mean, what in the state level they had Jim Crow segregation. The federal government had segregation in a few like the military, right? So some other things, but for the most part, it was basically the government was just sort of like a federal, like a Hispanic person or a Chinese person versus a white person. Most of the time, dealing with the federal government, it wouldn't be too different, right? I mean, the government didn't really have much concern with people's race other than black-white segregation.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know if the federal government ever segregated Asian Americans away in employment and so forth. I don't think so. Some states, there was actually disputes in the Jim Crow South whether the Chinese immigrants who came to the South, or a few thousand of them, should be sent to so-called colored schools or to the white schools. That really depended on the state and the jurisdiction. But for the most part, it was, in fact, white versus black. Mexicans were occasionally mistreated at the local level and treated separately, but for federal purposes, they were white. And indeed, when the United States signed a treaty with Mexico ceding all that territory in the Southwest, the rights of Mexicans were guaranteed to be full American citizens, unlike, say, black Americans. So it really changed is that for most of American history, it was advantageous to be considered white. So if Mexicans or any other group were folded into the white category, there was no reason to object. But once civil rights protection started in the 1950s, then it became advantageous to try to suggest that your group was something other than white. And also, by the way, I wanted to add something because there's a lot of confusion about this. Contrary to what amounts to a lot of historical mythology has somehow built up, Italians, Irish, Jews, Poles, other so-called ethnic minorities, while some people may not have thought of them as being white, while they may have always thought of themselves as being white, while they were subject often to harsh discrimination, sometimes violence, they were officially, almost in all situations, by the government and by private parties as well, like labor unions, considered to be white. So if you had a whites-only union, you were not excluding Jews or Italians. You might separately exclude them. You might have, we don't take Hebrews, we don't take Papists, that sort of thing. But that would be a separate exclusionary category. They were not considered non-white.
Yeah, and so like yeah, I mean, you might have like the thing they talk about the anti-Semitism is like the like social clubs. Like you could have something like that, right?
Right.
It was more religion than race. Is that your
It was
understanding? Even in
religion,
some ways?
and maybe what we might call ethnicity, right? But if your only restriction was whites only, right, and you were a Jewish person who wanted to join the club, that whites only policy would not be sufficient. You say, okay, well, we didn't mean only when we said whites only. We want to these other people too, but we have to add that people of the Hebrew persuasion or whatever
Further clarify, yeah.
are also not permitted, or people of South, people who are of Eastern European background for Poles or South, they have other phrases to use for people. But even when it comes to sort of restrictive covenants in property, if you said this property can only be sold to a white person, that would not exclude Jews or Catholics or other ethnic groups. You'd have to specifically, even Asians, you'd have to sometimes specifically mention them because there would be some ambiguity whether you only meant to exclude so-called colored people, which would be black.
Yeah, and one of the good pieces of evidence for the about Jews being considered white is the Confederacy. Their Secretary of State, Benjamin Judah, right? He was Jewish,
Right.
so
Now, he was subject to a lot of anti-Semitism,
I'm
but
sure he
again,
was.
that was, we can't go back. What a lot of historians and popular writers do also is they take the black white paradigm and they try to impose it on all of American history. But in fact, the United States has been a multi-ethnic country, while the black-white conflict and oppression by blacks and whites looms large in American history. Other groups simply were discriminated against in other ways, not for being non-white, but for not being Protestant or for not being Northern European, but not because they were considered non-white as such.
Yeah. And I said his name was Benjamin Judah. It's Judah Benjamin. I
Judah
got that.
Benjamin. I said it wrong somehow, but yeah.
It sounded wrong when I said it. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, Hispanics, interestingly, were. Do you know? I think I've heard that before the even the immigration bill of was it 65. Basically, there were no quotas on the Western Hemisphere, so as many people from Latin America could come as possible. Have you looked into that?
I haven't, but you know what? What happened twice in the 1930s and the 1950s were large-scale deportations of Mexicans who didn't have papers, and sometimes
Yeah.
even they did have papers, but didn't find them in time to stop being deported. And people will say, well, there's a lot of deportation of American citizens. It was mostly people who were here without papers, whose children were citizens, and if their parents are going to leave, the children generally aren't going to stay. So again, when we say that Mexicans were not considered necessarily by the federal government to be a non-white group, that doesn't mean that there weren't harsh consequences for being considered not as desirable, let's say, as other groups. It's just that on the federal census or federal segregation, or even in social life, right? There were the Negro leagues for black players, but there were plenty of Hispanic ball players in the United States. As long as you didn't look like you were black, if you were someone of Afro-Hispanic ancestry and looked black, they would send you off to the Negro leagues. But we had people like Lefty Gomez, a famous pitcher mid-century, who had Hispanic names, are obviously Hispanic, and no one said, "Oh, you can't be in the big leagues because you're not white."
Yeah. Do you think? I mean, it seems like I haven't read the book like how the Irish became white, but this stuff gets published all the time, and I haven't looked into it, but I've always been very skeptical. It seems like there's an effort to sort of there's two ways you could look at American history. You could look at American history from a white centric or a black centric perspective. So you could say blacks were treated in a special singled out for treatment in a bad way, or you could say whites were singled out for special treatment, and then and so the question is like it's sort of like depends on sort of your politics and your agenda if you want to say everyone else has been treated closer to the white end or closer to the black end. Do you see that as sort of that's how I sort of see the politics surrounding these debates. Does that make
Yeah,
sense to you?
yeah, that does. I've been thinking about lately why there's so much insistence that the Irish, for example, weren't considered white, and first of all, they're using a stylized ahistorical version of what it means white. When they say not white, they mean not fully accepted as the equals of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from Northern Europe, which is fine, but that doesn't mean you're not white. But I think the political valence comes down to, well, the sort of power structure of the United States consider all these people non-white, but then they sort of gradually allowed groups like the Irish or the Italians or the Jews to become white, and now all those groups have white privilege. But unlike them, black people can never sort of become white, and therefore we have to undo white privilege. So the idea is that certain groups were able to assimilate into whiteness because they were close enough, even though they were originally considered not white, but certain other groups can never assimilate into whiteness. It doesn't seem like there's any notion that we can all just assimilate into some sort of broad Americanness, which I think is actually at the grassroots level, despite a lot of counter trends at the elite level, is what's happening, particularly if you look at intermarriage rates and sort of just the way that the culture has come to accept interracial marriage. I think the most remarkable statistic of all statistics that one could come up with about race in America is that in 1958, 4% of respondents to a Gallup survey said they approved of interracial marriage. 4. not 40, not 14, 4. That means, by the way, in practice, that even most black people did not approve of interracial marriage because they were like 10%. So, and now it's well over 90%. And among young people, it's almost universal. And that is just a sea change in attitudes. And it's not just that they say that, it's there's actually, I mean, you just walk around, but statistically speaking, a huge percentage of people are marrying people from other races. And there is this opportunity for American identity to become this sort of multi-ethnic identity. But there are, of course, white nationalists who don't want that. But there's even a bigger group of people, I think, on the left who object to that. They believe that they I hate the phrase cultural Marxism because I don't really know what it means, and it seems to be used for a lot of stuff. But there is this idea that I think that racial groups have replaced the economic class system in the left wing imagination as sort of the permanent divisions of society. So it used to be the working class versus the bourgeoisie, right? And they'll be eternally in conflict, but that kind of became obviously stupid and untrue. So now the oppressed become those of white skin privilege, and the unoppressed uh, the oppressors become those with white skin privilege. The oppressed are those who don't, and this will be an eternal conflict that can only be managed by the government giving each group set privileges that assure equality, which is, basically, I'm generally libertarian political views, the least libertarian way you can imagine society, right? Where the government decides you're a member of this group and you get X privileges. I much prefer the idea that we could all just assimilate into Americans, have an American identity.
Yeah. And so when you say the sort of the political the political agenda here is to say, well, in the past these Irish people and these Italians, they assimilated into whiteness, but blacks can't. Do they have a theory as to why the Irish and Italians can and blacks can? Do these people have a view on Mexicans, for example? Do they think Mexicans are and Asians? Is this where the white adjacent thing about Asians come from? Is that sort
Yeah,
of the
well,
idea?
right. So So now it turns out that maybe even Asians. I mean, part of it is political, right? There's been ever since, um, counterintuitively, at least to our elites, the election of Donald Trump led to Hispanics becoming a more Republican rather than a less Republican constituency. There's this notion, well, maybe they're not really people of color, right? Maybe we made a mistake in sort of including them. So it's sort of a political thing, clearly. And the groups that they feel will be most politically useful to them are the ones who will be the oppressed. But there is no really good theory, sociologically speaking, other than, we do have a much stronger, more longer lasting history of uh, horrific discrimination based on African descent and other things. But there's no particular reason. I mean, I end the book with this. There are a lot of ethnic and religious conflicts in the U.S. that used to be really important, either regionally or nationally, that have just not only gone away, but that seem faintly ridiculous to us, right? There was massive violence against the early Mormon church, literally mobs running people out of town. There was massive hostility to Catholics. The Ku Klux Klan was the single most powerful non-party political organization in the United States in the 1920s. It was primarily anti-Catholic, not anti-black. I mean, they were anti-black and anti-Jewish too, but the real thing was we want to get rid of the Catholics, right? There were conflicts between Basque sheep herders and local ranchers. There were conflicts between Scandinavians in the Midwest and Germans, and on and on and on. The ascended Irish versus the Protestant establishment. People wouldn't vote for John F. Kennedy for president in 1960 because he was Catholic, and a lot of Catholics voted him precisely because they felt like they were an oppressed group and they wanted one of their own in the White House. And all these things seem crazy to us now, right? We have a Catholic president, no one cares. We have a mostly Catholic Supreme Court, no one really cares except when abortion comes up and people sort of claim, well, this must be a Catholic thing. We have a Catholic Speaker of the House, a Jewish Senate president. This would have been unthinkable in 1960, right? Not that long ago, only a little bit more before I was alive. And now it's routine. So why is it unthinkable that we could actually get beyond racial classification in the United States? I don't think it is, but I do think that to the extent that there are political constituencies who want to object to that, they're making it less likely.
Yeah, yeah. Although, maybe maybe there is a difference here in that the racial characteristics are, religion can become less important in society. I think people just care generally about religion less. So if people aren't religious, then what's the religious conflict about? Race, I think one thing why you might say is a little bit more intractable, and maybe you could look at other countries to see if other countries have gotten beyond race to see uh, how plausible this is for the U.S. is that you have these physical differences, and they correlate with statistical differences in outcomes, right? Socioeconomic status, test scores. I mean, people tend to care about these phenotypic differences. People tend to relate to others like them, and so maybe that's always going to be sort of a festering wound as long as there are disparities, which there'll always be disparities. I'm not one of these people who think we're going to solve these disparities. I mean, I think they'll always be there at some level. So is that possibly an argument for this stuff maybe being intractable to a certain degree?
Uh, it is an argument, but I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that it wasn't that long ago. I actually said this at a speech at University of Chicago Law School. So my name is David Bernstein. It wasn't that long ago if I would go up and give a speech at somewhere like University of Chicago, people would look at me, hear my name, say a Jew, and that would color what they would think about my, at least for a significant percent, what they think about my talk, what
Now you have to
assumptions
you
they
have to
make.
go to Twitter for that now.
Right, right. Or I don't know. I don't know anything about. I don't know anything about your background, but Richard Hanania, I'm going to think, oh, maybe Lebanese background or whatever. So, and that was
Palestinian plus, yeah.
okay, yeah. So that's the sort of thing people would think, and some people, there's some small fraction that might think that now, but mostly they just see a white guy. And how did that happen, right? There was no department of erasing ethnic differences. There was no reparations. There was no special dorms, special orientations. At some point, society just decided through some Hayekian kind of process, we're just not going to care what ethnic group a white person is from. And we're just going to consider them all generically white. Now, it's a little bit harder with the history we have and with and so forth with black, but can we some just decide that people are, you know, are generically American? Well, we could. I mean, speaking of Palestinian, I mean, there's what's her name? The activist Linda Sarsour, who insists that she's a person of color. She's fairer skinned than I am, but said I am an oppressed member of an oppressed minority, so therefore I am a person of color. And the media kind of goes along with this, but really, in practice, if she was walking around, even with her headscarf on, people would say, "Oh, there goes a white Muslim woman." If anything, maybe or just a white woman. But if you decide, hey, we are going to insist that the government classify everybody, and that will have the social, it'll be more likely to happen. I mean, the government doesn't control the. Interestingly enough, like I said, despite a lot of political salience to dividing people by race, and the fact that a lot of interest groups want people divided by race, Americans are intermarrying and so forth. But also, interestingly enough, like most people who are Asian American, if you ask them, and it's not me who asked them, like actual scientific public opinion surveys, say we don't identify with the label Asian American. Uh, Hispanic Americans or Latino Americans, depending on your preference, if you ask them, they'll say, yeah, we're okay with being called Hispanic or Latino, but we'd rather be called Mexican American or Guatemalan American or whatever, or Cuban American, or just American. So if you go to an elite college, this notion that there's such a thing as an Asian American or that you're a Latino and that's your identity, that's just sort of accepted as commonplace. But the public itself has not completely gone along with that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, given how much sort of propaganda there is towards this racial classification from elite sources, the fact that you can poll and this Hispanic, pan Hispanic identity is not that popular. The fact that people will of all races oppose racial quotas in polls. There's something. I think there's something deep in the American culture that resists sort of what's coming from elites. So I think you're right. I think there is. Sort of a case for optimism there. Yeah, it's funny. The Linda Sarsour. There was I don't know if you saw this in the New York Times. There was this graphic, and they had faces of power, and they were just counting white people and people of color, and they had like, here's Fortune 500 CEOs, here's the Senate, here's Congress, and this was a big spread in the New York Times. And so like the people considered white would be in like one color, and then the people who are people of color were like had a different background. And then like you go in there and you have like Justin Amash, and he's considered white, and then Rashida Tlaib is considered a person of color. And John Sununu was a Middle Eastern background too, is also considered a white person, and some other Middle Easterners also considered a person of color. And I asked the New York Times about this on Twitter, and I didn't expect a response, but they responded. They said something like, we asked for self-identification. So there were these people for the exact. They had to like put everyone in a white or non-white category. People from exact same backgrounds, and they put them. I thought they were just doing it politically. I thought they were just doing Republicans
Right,
are white, and then
right,
Democrats from the same place are non-white. But no, they according to them, they actually went out and asked these congressmen um, and these other people what they identified as. So I think you're right. Um, I always thought I thought there was this. Have you seen the polls on Hispanics lately? I mean, the Hispanics, they shifted towards Republican in 2020, but the polls indicate, if anything, that's accelerating since the 2020 election. I mean, it's really. I mean, they look like basically white people in some polls. Have you seen this?
yeah. I mean, look, there's really there was a significant amount of pretty bad discrimination in parts of California, Texas, New Mexico against Mexican laborers and so forth. But we have to remember the vast majority of Hispanics who are in the United States are actually post 1965 immigrants who are subject to civil rights laws, even affirmative action. And there's really no reason inherently to think that their ultimate trajectory would be any different than other immigrant groups who are somewhat darker than the average white American, right? Like Greeks or Turks or or Arab Americans or anybody else. There's just the Ford Foundation, among others, in the '60s decided, well, if we want to have a more left-wing America, we need to create more minority groups that will become constituents of the federal government. They had a very significant project to make Hispanics think of themselves as such and create an infrastructure like the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund. And oddly enough, they were helped in this by none other than Richard Nixon, who was concerned about Chicano activist radicalism and Puerto Rican nationalism, and he felt like creating a pan-Hispanic identity would de-radicalize them by giving them a more American-centered identity, but also make them possible constituencies for affirmative action that he could pay off. And then the really interesting thing about it is, okay, well, then Nixon says, wait a second, but if we're going to help the Puerto Ricans and the Mexicans, who are in fact often of more indigenous ancestry and look darker, what about the Cuban Americans? They vote for us, but they're also overwhelmingly self-identified as white and lighter skinned overall. And so he added them. And once you add Cuban Americans, you can't really exclude anybody, right? Argentines, Venezuelans, because they're as European descended as just about any other group. So all of a sudden we have white people essentially who happen to have Spanish-speaking ancestries being considered a minority group. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah. Don't law schools though do ask you about Mexico? I remember, if I recall correctly, they ask you about if you're Mexican or Puerto Rican. They don't ask you if you're Hispanic, so they exclude Cubans. Am I remembering that right?
That was interestingly enough, they used to do that in the Grutter case involving affirmative action at the University of Michigan Law School before the Supreme Court. The district court actually found the University of Michigan Law School's rationale for why they were engaging in affirmative action, which was diversity of ethnicity in higher education, couldn't be true because they limited the Hispanic category to Mexicans and Puerto Ricans born in the mainland. And clearly, if they wanted diversity, the more different Latino groups they had, the better. So University of Michigan denied that they had done that. The Supreme Court didn't really address the issue, but they denied it. They said, oh, no, we consider all Hispanics the same. And that, I think, is sort of the black letter law now. They do ask you when you apply to college which Hispanic group you're from. But I don't think that is necessarily meaningful in admissions unless for some reason they have like a Mexican American group on campus and they want to make sure they have enough students to keep it going, whatever. But as far as affirmative action goes, there's no difference between being even a Spaniard. Your parents could have been wealthy descendants of Queen Isabella, who've been dominating Spain for centuries and have always been a wealthy, powerful family. You come to the U.S. become a citizen, you're as eligible for affirmative action as the Campesino coming from rural Mexico who has a third grade education and is very dark skinned.
So yeah, I remember being interested in this stuff. So when I was 2010, I went to law school, and I remember that still being the norm. It was Mexican and Puerto Rican. I remember looking into it. Maybe I'm misremembering, and the
It's
Cubans were
possible.
still excluded.
It's possible that some law schools never updated their application materials, but I think that would, oddly enough, leave them vulnerable. Ironically, maybe leave them vulnerable to a lawsuit. The reason I say it's ironic is that the reason that Puerto Ricans and Mexicans were originally put into, in the 1950s, the federal government started monitoring its contractors for discrimination, and the categories were white, Mexican, and white, black, Mexican, Puerto Rican. Sometimes they had Jews on there, and then others. You could list other groups if you want to. Jews fell out. Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans were there because they had low socioeconomic indicators, and they were felt to be subject to race discrimination because many of them had significant Indian or African ancestry. So the idea was that they're somehow akin to African Americans, and they did face something like Jim Crow in some parts of the country. But now it applies to all people who happen to have a Spanish-speaking ancestor. So, example I like to give, a lot of Latinos who I know who benefit from affirmative action, their ancestors fled Nazi Germany, stopped off in Cuba or Costa Rica or Argentina for a generation, then came to the United States, and now they're Hispanic. And why, Juan Goldberg, whose ancestors stopped off in Cuba, gets affirmative action, but Jonathan Goldberg, whose ancestors have exactly the same look, culture, ethnicity, and everything else, but didn't ever happen to speak Spanish, doesn't really make any sense, but that's what we have.
Yeah. So do you think you think so? You look back at the time in the 1970s when this Hispanic sort of identity, at least at elite levels, was sort of coalescing. Do you think, do you see more as the if you had to I don't know, maybe it's too intertwined to answer this question, but is it more the federal government or is it like the Ford Foundation that's basically the impetus to have this broader category?
So Mike Gonzalez, who's at the Heritage Foundation, wrote a book about this that came out, I think, last year. He really emphasizes the role of the left-wing foundations and activists, but I think that the left-wing foundations and activists would have been perfectly happy to have like a separate Mexican American identity and a separate Puerto Rican identity, and with maybe loose connections. And it was really, to a large extent, the federal government that wanted to homogenize this. And the homogenization was partly for the political reasons I mentioned, and partly because they have to count somehow, and the fewer categories they have, the
Yeah, easier.
easier. And how do do you want to stop breaking up into every single different group? But also, and this is getting more into sociology than my own expertise in law. But there was a strong sociological and economic reason for this, which is that when Univision was created, right, the national network of Spanish-speaking TV channels, they found that Mexicans wouldn't watch shows from Cuba, you wouldn't get it, from Argentina, and Puerto Ricans wouldn't watch shows from Mexico, and that was a problem for them, right? Because then they would have to appeal to all different markets. So Univision launched a big campaign itself to create a pan-Hispanic identity so they could better market Spanish language programming from any country in Latin America to all American Latinos.
Yeah, yeah. There's a good book on this called "Making Hispanics," which I think you cite, that goes into the Univision thing, which is funny because it was sort of the FCC, the licensing, all that other stuff.
Right.
It's just a big mess. So that's the Hispanic category, was sort of a accounting thing. I mean, Asian American Pacific Islander, I always thought sort of funny. It just sounds so arbitrary. I mean, it sounds like saying Arabs and Argentinians. I mean, it just seems like so completely random. So how did we, what's the story of how we ended up with that?
Well, when these classifications were being adopted first for civil rights purposes in the late 50s and early 60s, Asian Americans were recognized as a racial minority group, obviously Japanese, Chinese, Filipinos, and of course Japanese Americans had recently been interned in the camps during World War II, so there was certainly some impetus to ensure they didn't face formal discrimination. But really, there were so few people of Asian descent, of that part of East Asian descent in the United States at the time, that no one really talked about it too much. It wasn't any organized effort by anybody. It was like, oh, we have to fill out these forms. Oh, let's just throw in the Japanese and Chinese. Only like 500,000 of them in the country anyway. And if we see somewhere where a lot of Japanese live and no Japanese are being employed, we can investigate. But no one really thought about it all that much. And then in the 1970s, when there was becoming increasing immigration, there had been a movement among activists to sort of consolidate Japanese and Chinese and Filipino and other Americans into an Asian American group. It was the so-called Yellow Movement by radicals. They said whites treat us all alike, but this was a really difficult task because Japanese and Filipinos and Chinese mutually traditionally hate each other because of their of what happened back home, especially during World War II. But the United States government decided to create a category for all of them. I think primarily, again, we have to count people. Different agencies are counting them differently. There aren't really enough Japanese and Chinese and Filipinos at the time in the United States, and certainly not Indians, to have separate categories for each. So, and the kind of person who discriminated against Chinese would probably discriminate against Japanese too. This is mostly for civil rights purposes. So let's just add them in. Now, Indians are a really interesting example or phenomenon because there are very few Indians, South Asians in the United States. By the 1960s, after 65, there started to be more and more, but there still weren't very many. And they were originally classified as white. When the government drafted its official classifications, they were put into the white category. And so, well, they're Asian. Well, Iranians, Iraqis, Palestinians, and so forth. They're all from Asia also, and they're all classified as white. Armenians. So they were originally classified as white, and people pointed out, well, they're phenotypically Caucasian, even if they have dark skin often, and they're economically overall pretty successful. So why put them in a minority category? But one of the few existing Asian Indian organizations got wind of this and said, we want to be invited to the meetings of Asian civil rights groups. We want to be eligible for government contract affirmative action. And they lobbied to have Indians included in the Asian category. And they succeeded. If the classifications had been made 5 years earlier, before there were enough Asian Indians in the United States to have a lobbying group, Indian Americans would have been classified as white.
Yeah, all this stuff is so, I mean, it's just amazing, like, the consequent it's so this little thought is put into it. I mean, I think one point you mentioned in the book, there was some comment period in some agency or something, and hundreds were in favor of classifying Indians as Asians, and then but, like, only, like, a handful of people even, like, sent any message to the agency that they shouldn't. Do you remember this?
Yeah, because there was an organized effort to write letters from this one group to support it, and no one else was really paying attention. So there's no organized opposition. So they just okay, well, no one's really, but it wasn't like anyone. It was in general. I mean, we should go back a little bit. So Caspar Weinberger was Secretary of Health Education and Welfare, which is now the Department of Health and Human Services, in 1973, and he got this report from the education folks in saying, we're really having a hard time gathering education statistics because some of our sub agencies are listing Mexicans, Cubans, and Puerto Ricans separately. Some are listing them as Spanish-speaking households. Some are listing them as Spanish surname. And we can't. It's all apples and oranges. We can't compare the data. So Caspar Weinberger said, let's get some commission together with a bunch of different agencies and try to standardize these classifications. And they did, but they didn't do it in like any sort of let's get together sociologists and population experts and the Census Bureau and all that. They did it in sort of the one example that I know the most about is Hispanic. And what they literally did was they found one woman in the government who was Puerto Rican, one who was Cuban American and one who was Mexican American, and they saw that each of these women would represent the entire population of this group, and they were just low level, relatively junior government officials who volunteered to do this, and they just sat in a room and decided we're going to call this what. Latino? Now we don't like that. Hispano, Spanish, certainly no. We like it. We decide on Hispanic. They argued about for a while. They decided on Hispanic, and by deciding on Hispanic, we're excluding Brazilians, but including people from Spain. Why? Because we three people decided that Spanish descent is the key. And that's what happened without, and there was no real public debate about it, no real public discussion. No one really thought it was that important. The standards themselves, and this is really only for data collection purposes. We're not going to use this for determining eligibility for government programs. This is not meant to be anthropological or scientific in nature, and yet almost immediately it was used for government programs and has come to be considered anthropological in nature.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so it seems like these are sort of consequential decisions, just how the government relates to the citizenry, how it how it sort of interacts with them, whether it sees us as individuals, as or members of groups that get certain privileges, given to us or taken away. And it's not like because the Indian American group was like so powerful, like they were not powerful at all. Like it seems like if there was just I think back to sort of alternative history. If there was one or two congressmen, maybe, who were willing to sort of lean on the agencies and said, well, what's the justification for this? Could it have been differently? I mean, did it take the what if anyone was sort of awake and paying attention and sort of asking to justify this, might have things gone a different way if, from your reading of the history?
Sure, and there were people who were advocating, for example, on behalf of Italian Americans and Polish Americans, saying they should be enumerated separately. In fact, by 1973, there was, I think I'm the first one to have actually looked at this document, and I don't know how long because I didn't see it cited anywhere. I came across it kind of randomly at archive.com. The Civil Rights Commission of the U.S. put out a report on classifications in 73, and they found that a lot of agencies were using a classification called other, and they would use it for groups that were locally known to have historically faced discrimination and have low socioeconomic status. Cajuns in Louisiana, or French speakers in New Hampshire, Portuguese immigrants in Massachusetts, and that there was no such category added eventually, but it could just as easily have been Italians and Poles and perhaps Jews were not included, despite some efforts, especially for Poles and Italians, primarily because African American congressmen who were interested in this were policing the boundaries. And the people who were appointed to run the programs and so forth were often, originally almost all affirmative action programs were really considered to be for African Americans, even though now probably Hispanics and Asians dominate federal contracting, affirmative action, not blacks. It was considered an African American program. And they said, it's okay, we don't mind if you add Hispanics because they're our political allies and there aren't that many of them. And we don't mind if you include Asians, there are so few of them, but you can't include Italians and Poles. They're white and they don't deserve anything. One of the more interesting little anecdotes in the book is that there was a movement to include Hasidic Jews. Hasidic Jews have some claim to be considered a disadvantaged minority for federal contracting purposes. They dress funny. They have funny accents. Their first language is often Yiddish. I mean, I'm not saying their accents are actually funny, but my grandmother had an accent like that. But to your mainstream America, they have all sorts of religious restrictions that make it difficult for them to be in mainstream society. So they said we should get these benefits too. And a couple of agencies they did, they still do. But when it came to the Small Business Administration, Congressman Parren Mitchell, who was an African-American congressman, sort of put his foot down and said, I object strongly to this. It's going to cause trouble. And he persuaded the SBA at the last minute to back off of that. On the other hand, when Indians were originally excluded, and I think other Asians as well, and they lobbied, he was okay with that. So there's an example, for better or for worse, that this one congressman had a lot of influence on who is ultimately considered a minority, and it was just his arbitrary view of who is sort of a deserving of minority treatment and who isn't.
Yeah. So was it because, with the agency, so if like a Southern, if a Southern senator had, or, conservative had stood up and said, Indians shouldn't, be getting small business loans, set aside for minorities if they were trying to contract, it seems like maybe that would not have worked. Did sort of the black congressmen and the civil rights leaders, did they have this sort of moral aura about them where they could sort of, the, federal agencies would listen to them?
They had the aura. They were often also the people who were in charge of the relevant programs, and they had the ear, especially of Jimmy Carter, because this was all going on during the Carter administration. So he wanted to satisfy his African American constituency. So the official classifications themselves were made almost without really much in the way of political lobbying, but once they had to be enforced by the agencies and they had all these different like boundary issues and who's eligible for what program, definitely a lot of politics came into. Again, like you said, it was often just there was one voice speaking up and no one really objected. So the Small Business Administration, for whatever reason, for example, declined to go along with the with the rules that the rest of the government had to follow, and they decided that their category for Hispanic was actually not going to be Hispanic, but was going to be Latino or something like that, and it was going to include Brazilians, and would not include people from Spain. So then there was something called the Spanish American or the Iberian American, something like that, Contractors Association of McLean, Virginia, who happens to be very close to the Capitol, so easy for them to lobby. And they said, we don't think this is right. We are, if someone sees the name Rodriguez or Hernandez, they don't know if we're Mexican or Spanish, so we face the same discrimination, so we should be included as Spanish Americans. And the SBA said, okay, no one seems to be objecting to that. There aren't very many Spanish Americans around, so let's include Spanish Americans. And then they said, but wait a second, if we were already including Brazilians as Latinos, and then we're including Spanish as Hispanic, don't we need to include Portuguese? And the Portuguese got included too, which, you wouldn't think would have that much of an effect on anything, but then it turns out that in 1990, the DC government discovered after an audit that 80% of all contracts that were set aside for minorities in the District of Columbia were going to these three brothers who were Portuguese. So you have a city that's like 65% African American at the time. The program was really meant primarily to help African American businessmen, but a bunch of white immigrants from Portugal are actually getting almost all the benefits.
Yeah, yeah, that's funny, and yeah, like as you said there, the reason this matters is because government at the federal and local and state level often has set asides, right? A certain percentage have to go to minorities. The small business administration basically just has a pot of money. It just gives to anyone who's a quote unquote minority. Is that how it works?
Something like that. I mean, there are some legal restrictions. I mean, most people think, I kind of thought actually, until I started writing this book, the Supreme Court theoretically invalidated strict quotas for set-asides in the late 1980s and 1990s. But what happened is they had a loophole that said, but if you could prove via a legitimate study that there was historical discrimination against certain minorities in your city, town, state, whatever, and that has continuing ramifications, then you're allowed to still do it. So a whole industry popped up that created really often pretty bogus studies, but enough to give a rationale for what the city was doing. Often contractors associations would sue, the law would get overturned, so they just then, the city would then just create another study, pay for another study, and they don't have to sue again. They eventually realize they're never going to be able to win. It's costing them a fortune to constantly challenge these things. So there are some set-asides, there's also just preferences, bid preferences. If we take 10% off your bid if you're a member of a particular minority group. And the interesting thing about it is we're all used to thinking about affirmative action in college admissions because that gets the most attention. And affirmative action in college admissions, African Americans get by far the biggest preferences. Hispanics get a smaller preference. American Indians get a smaller preference. And Asians get no preference or perhaps face discrimination. But when it comes to contracting, all minorities get the exact same level of preference. So there was a profile in the Washington Post about a decade ago, which I thought was so outrageous, but nevertheless, no one seemed outraged except me, of a woman who immigrated here from India, had a lot of resources, figured out that she was eligible when she became a citizen for minority contract and built an $80 million fortune on government contracting. I was like, well, good for her for being so entrepreneurial, but surely no one thinks that the point of affirmative action in government contracting was to help wealthy immigrants from India or China or Mexico or anywhere else become extremely wealthy and not help Americans whose families suffered centuries of discrimination in the country.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's better from a competence perspective. If you include as many people as possible, you'll get at least the best from a bigger, a bigger slice of the world. So, maybe from a sort of a good governance, perspective, it's maybe a preferable policy.
These classifications, interestingly enough, do tend to be based on heritage, and there's no percent except there's weird stuff with Native Americans that have a separate chapter on their sort of own category, and a lot of special laws that apply to them, and some of those require a 1/4 blood quantum, which is fascinating in itself. The government will actually issue you a certificate of what your blood quantum is. It sort of reeks of to me of like Nazi stuff, but nevertheless it's out there. But except for that, no one says, well, exactly what percentage of descent you have to have. And I think it's pretty clear that almost any agency will accept grandparent and maybe beyond, but certainly at least grandparent. So as we have more and more intermarriage in the United States, we have more people who have one Hispanic or one Asian or one Native American or one African American grandparent, we're going to increase basically within a generation, 80% or something of Americans going to be eligible for these things, which will make them completely pointless. So one thing I've mentioned in the book is that if you are in favor of affirmative action, do believe that members of historically discriminated against minorities should be given preferences in contracting. You should be concerned about this phenomenon, because if everyone's getting a preference, then in effect, no one is.
Yeah. So going back to what you said about the use of study. So this is, I mean, this is fascinating because this is how things often work. You have this you had this court case. It was called Cronson, right?
Crossed, yeah.
Croson, yeah. And so you have the conservative wing who doesn't want this stuff. You have a liberal wing that does, but you have like Sandra Day O'Connor, right? Does she? Was it her opinion, or Lisa O'Connor's? I
Yes,
think the
yes,
swing
right.
vote in this. And the idea is you can have it, but not in all circumstances. You have to prove that there has been historical discrimination against. If you want to in Richmond, Virginia, if you want to give minority set-asides to Koreans, you have to prove that Richmond, Virginia, at some point in history, discriminated against Koreans, and they're not doing well. And so what happens is whatever they want to do anyway, like a cottage industry of studies show up, and so you get the same policy in the end, but you've just wasted a bunch of government money and resources and effort on these studies, these so-called experts that are going to come and tell the government what it wants to do anyway. That's basically what happened, right? You had the worst of all worlds from this sort of moderate opinion.
Right. I mean, if in there have been some limits, right? So I mean, for example, the city of Richmond had included Aleuts, people from the Aleutian Islands, and things like that. If there's a group that really isn't present in a city, they won't be included. And there have been some court decisions saying, well, you can have blacks and Hispanics but not Asians, or Asians and blacks but not Hispanics. But for the most part, yeah, things have gone back the way they were, except now we waste a lot of money on studies. And you can say a similar. I mean, I think we got the worst of all worlds also from the Bakke decision, right? So the rationale really for affirmative action was, look, we have a whole group of people in the United States, primarily African American, who are isolated from mainstream society, deprived of educational opportunities, who are still very segregated. So we want to make sure that if we don't have any black doctors, most white doctors don't want to practice in black neighborhoods. We want to have to make sure that they're served. All those reasons all make a certain amount of sense, right? Whether you agree with them or disagree with them, you can imagine that. And Justice Powell says, "Oh no, we can't. You can't do it for that reason. The real reason, it has to be for educational diversity." So that means that instead of actually having a pragmatic reason for trying to do this to bring people into the mainstream society, instead it's all about whether we have more of designated groups, why these particular people are diverse and not others, like why, so you're Palestinian, why having, let's say, the first Palestinian at University of Michigan does not add to diversity, but having the 100th Mexican would, doesn't make any sense at all. Powell in Bakke, and I think O'Connor in Croson was assuming a certain amount of good faith on the part of the actors involved. They really were going to then try to create educational diversity. They really would only try to include groups who had historically and faced and were still currently facing discrimination in contracting. But it turns out in anything that involves politics and ideology, and especially with regard to race, I think is a particularly sensitive topic, good faith is hard to come by. People have their preconceived notions, and they're going to do what they want to do. And if you give them an out, they will take it. So in both cases, I think you have been better off, if anything, just saying, well, look, if you want to redress the historical exclusion of African Americans from slavery times till today in a narrow way, go ahead and do that. But don't go telling us that the son of the Mexican ambassador to the United States who decided to stay here after he finished his private school should be getting a preference for anything in particular. Don't tell us that Indian Americans, almost all who are one of the wealthiest groups in the United States, and almost all of whom came since the 1970s, when America was a much more racially and ethnically liberal society it's ever been. Don't tell us that they're in the sort of the same position as African Americans, that they need to be getting special help in contracting. It doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah. What are the magnitudes as far as government contracting? Like, so government contracts with a zillion different companies for an infinite number of reasons. Federal, state, local governments, they do a lot of contracting. Well, what are we talking on magnitudes here? Is it a huge part of what government does through the private sector, or is it more limited?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, it's a little bit, I'm mostly focused on the classification issue. I should point out that while affirmative action comes up a lot because that's the area where racial classification is most prominent, controversial, has the most effect on people's lives, except maybe nowadays they're trying to move into medical treatment, which we could talk about. But the so I'm not a huge expert on how the affirmative action programs actually work in practice. The statistic I've seen is that approximately $300 billion of federal contracts are subject to these rules. So for the most part, the rules, there are some quotas of you must have a certain percentage, but for the most part, they tend to be you get a preference in bidding, and the preference varies depending on the jurisdiction. So even if you have the preference, doesn't mean you're going to win the bid. So I don't know precisely how much, and there's all sorts of complications. So, for example, a lot of the minority contracts, it turns out that a company of all white men will you'll have a figurehead, a president who is of a minority group, or you'll have someone, named John Smith, whose great great grandfather came here from Spain, and they'll list themselves. So, and I thought the most interesting issue, given that the history of these programs is that they were really meant primarily to bring African Americans into the mainstream, and they were marketed as such in the 70s. What percentage of of the affirmative action beneficiaries in government contracts today are African American? It's impossible. I have a friend who said, I know people in the Trump administration, in the Department of Transportation, they would have this information. I will ask them if they will slip it, to me to give to you. And the response I got back a few weeks later was, no one will ever release this information because it would be incredibly embarrassing to the government, and no one wants to bear the responsibility of anyone finding out they release it. So my wild guess, and I have a little bit of data, but not much, is that less than 20% of the contracts that are subject to affirmative action and going to minorities are going to African Americans. It may be way less, it may be closer to 20, I don't know. But I'm getting, if you think about it, since African Americans are have the fewest assets of all the ethnic groups, have lower educational levels, you would expect that on an even playing field among minority groups, that the Indian engineer who works for Microsoft decides to start his own company or one is obviously going to be in a better position to get these contracts than the sort of intended beneficiaries.
Yeah, I did see some data on the Small Business Administration. I don't remember the exact, but they did have broken down by the set aside programs, and it was primarily Asian, as you would suspect. I don't know, I don't think that covers the entirety of the government. It's just the SBA, and it's just might have just been one program in the SBA. But yeah, your suspicions were confirmed from what I've seen. Um, so yeah, you have the you mentioned the scientific classifications. This is fascinating. Can you talk about this, because we've made medical research have to adhere to these arbitrary categories that government made up. I mean, this is just unbelievable. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So back in the early 90s, a bunch of women's groups got together and said, we don't like the way medical research is being done in this country because disproportionately it's being done on men. And men and women are actually physiologically different in a variety of ways. And it could turn out that if you're not getting a sufficient representation of women, you're not really finding out whether something's really safe and effective for women. And the reason that women were not being included in studies is because you're always concerned with whether if they're pregnant, there could be side effects, and they have their cycles that make, with hormonal cycles that make the time of the month more relevant for certain kinds of drugs. So it's easier just to deal with men. So they said, okay, it's easier for the companies to deal with men. We want to make them deal with women too. Not completely unreasonable. At the last minute, when legislation along these lines was going through Congress, some African American members of Congress said, you know what? A lot of these studies are being done primarily on white men. And we don't like that. There are historical reasons for that too. There's a lot of distrust of the medical establishment in the African American community. All the more reason to require them to reach out and include African Americans. Now, the problem with this is that for the most part, there's really no particular reason to think, unlike men and women, that there's significant physiological differences between what we call racial groups. But nevertheless, they start pushing for that. Eventually, Congress mandated the National Institutes of Health and the Federal Food and Drug Administration to require all researchers to get enough members of racial minority groups in their studies. They did not specify which groups. They just said, make sure you have racial minorities. So the FDA and NIH could have actually done something along the lines of get a bunch of scientists together, geneticists, anthropologists, whatever, and say, okay, if we are going to do this in a serious scientific way, what groups do we want to study, right? And there are and the groups that we might want to study don't necessarily match at all with the racial groups, right? There are several groups: Ashkenazic Jews, Icelanders, Hungarians, Gypsies, right? That have their own, that were sort of isolated from population either by religious restrictions or by geography, being islands and so forth. And we'll study it that way and make sure we have representatives. But two problems with that. First of all, there's so many little subgroups. What do you do? And secondly, if you want to imagine uproar, imagine the FDA actually getting people together, scientists together, to try to figure out which groups are really genetically different. So they just took the easiest, least common denominator way out and said, okay, we're just going to use these statistics that were made only for civil rights enforcement purposes, that specifically said they're not to be used for scientific or anthropological anything. And said, we're going to use those. So now we have a situation where medical researchers who have any ties also to the federal government, which is most medical research, and all drugs that have to be approved, all medical devices have to be approved, have to make sure they have enough representatives of these different minority groups to satisfy the FDA, and it's just completely nuts. For example, take Hispanics. You have to have enough Hispanics. Putting aside the question of what enough means, and enough is, if you have a representative, something close to the representation of a population, that's probably enough. What racial group are Hispanics? What genetic differences do they have? It's like saying American. They're a multi-racial group. They're European. They're indigenous, and the indigenous groups have different subgroups. The Europeans have different subgroups within them. Not all Spaniards are the same. Basques are not the same as Catalonians in their genetic history, and so forth. They have African. There are people who are Hispanic or of Asian descent. There are a lot of people who have African ancestry. So it makes absolutely no scientific sense to say you have to have extra representation of Hispanic, except for this. People say, well, if you don't have enough Hispanics, then Hispanics are going to think that since it wasn't tested on them, it may not be safe and effective for them. But as I point out, whenever this issue comes up, and this is true for Black people and any other group as well, it's circular. The reason Hispanic people think that Hispanics need to be included is because the government has decided they need to be included. I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. I am completely aware that Ashkenazi Jews have some diseases that we're much more susceptible to. I'm aware that we have certain genetic anomalies that are not common to other European populations. I don't worry about not being represented in, say, vaccine studies, because there's really no reason to, but I have more reason to worry than someone who's Hispanic, right? But I don't, because no one tells me to. So it's completely circular, and it's absurd, and it costs lives. Moderna actually was forced by the head of NIH. Head of NIH said, I'm not going to endorse your vaccine unless you get more members of minority groups in your studies, and delayed their research by a few weeks. I don't know how many lives that cost, but for nothing, because there was no reason to think that vaccines would work differently. Why would mRNA work differently on a Black person than on a white person? It was completely preposterous. And then you have these additional problems. Even if you thought that race was salient for medical research, which most scientists don't, the way we classify race, I gave you the Hispanic example, right? But the way we classify race has nothing to do with anything that would actually be genetically race. So Ethiopians, for example, or Somalians are closer genetically to Arabs and Jews and other sort of Middle Eastern originated groups than they are to sub-Saharan Africans. But we put them in the African category because that's how we classify anyone with Black ancestry as African. Then people from South Asia are Caucasian, if you want to go by so-called race, They're not East. They're very different from East Indians, but they're all Asian. So you could have a study that has the requisite percentage of Asians, but you don't know if those Asians were Chinese or Filipino, who are mostly Austronesian anthropologically, or South Asian, who are Caucasian. So it's completely meaningless. But it's the government requires you to do it, and this has two really bad effects besides potentially delaying research. First, it's been inhibiting scientists from doing what they really should do, which was really look at actual genetics. Genetic tests are quick and cheap. Look for the genes that you're looking for. Try to find the genes that might differ among groups rather than looking at race. And the other thing that it does is that it gives this false sense of that we've actually tested things that we haven't. We don't know if you've tested it on black subjects, if you've tested it on Ethiopians or Somalians, if you're located in Minnesota and you go to the Somalian community to get your African American quota filled, it tells you nothing about West Africans who make up most of the American black population.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I do have to say that I don't think actually the genetic distance from Ethiopians and Somalis is closer to Middle Easterners than West Africans. My friend Razib Khan does all these studies. He's done my genome, and yeah, you could do a chart. And I don't think it's, but your larger point is correct. These things
I'm not.
are
I read that. I read that in respectable sources, but I am no geneticist, so I
yeah.
will not go on. But yeah, I mean, but part of the problem is, so the third problem is that this is actually seeping down into medical. This has seeped down to medical care. So they'll ask you when you come to the hospital, or whatever, are you black or white or wherever you are, or if you're unconscious, they will just assume, and they actually will sometimes have different medical ways of different decisions of what drugs to give you, or how to treat you if you have heart disease or whatever, based on your race. But there's very little scientific evidence for these things. But even if there was scientific evidence, so if you happen, there's a very interesting study where they actually asked people their race, and then they asked doctors to identify with the race. And not a single person of American Indian descent was correctly identified as American Indian. So you may have your protocols about how to deal with American Indians, and even if they're right, you're not doing it because you're not identifying the people that way when they come in unconscious.
Yeah, yeah, and the people who say they're American Indians, and don't look American Indian, I don't know how much American Indian ancestry they have on average. Yeah, this thing about the trust and sort of the scientific process. This reminds me of the other thing about the vaccine, where they would people would say, why don't they speed up the approval, and they would say, well, then people won't trust it, or like there's some recommendation, and they would say, we can't tell people the exact truth because then they won't trust, or we can't everything makes sense about this, but we have to maintain trust in the process. And it seems like public health, what they were doing was they were doing this sort of pop psychology. They didn't have studies for their psychological assumptions. If we speed up the RNA vaccine, it will lead to anti-vax sentiment. That's one thing they would say. No studies, no research, said this. And it sounds like they were doing the exact same thing with the race stuff. They had a bureaucratic thing they wanted to do. They just wanted to make as little work from possible as possible for themselves. And then they sort of made up an ad hoc sort of pop psychological, explanation of why that makes sense. And there was just no reason for it. I mean, isn't that what's going on here?
Sure. I mean, look, there's even if you thought that for some reason it was scientifically important to have all the minority groups included, the thing to have done would have been to proceed and say, but if you're worried, we haven't tested this in enough Hispanics. If you are worried about that, you could wait, but why deprive other people of it? But more generally, right? I mean, if you were someone like my elderly parents who have heart conditions and that, who's especially vulnerable to COVID, your risk reward ratio is quite different than a healthy 20-year-old. And you might be saying, I'm willing, I don't need the full study, right? If you have preliminary results that say that this will protect me, I'm willing to go with that. Just give me the data, let me make up my own mind rather than, decide for me what you think is in the societal interest. But we see that, and, as people, when I've written about this, people pointed out, it wasn't a point I made originally, people pointed out to me, one of the oddities about the way they do this research is actually very similar to the diversity thing in higher education. So University of Michigan says we want diversity, but diversity is 13% African Americans, 8% Hispanics, and 1% American Indians, which happens to match the population of who applies to University of Michigan. But why would it be 13% for African Americans and 1% for American Indians if diversity was really the issue? Similarly, with vaccine trials or drug trials, if you thought that race has scientific, as we define it, has scientific salience, you want a statistically significant number of each group, not
That's
to have
funny.
them,
Funny.
not to have them match the population. It doesn't make sense to say we want to make sure American Indians are okay, so we'll test 1% of them. We want to make
Yeah.
sure blacks are okay, so we make sure 14% of the subjects are black.
Yeah.
It's just a randomly matching the population rather than any kind of scientific rationale at all. So this is especially disturbing to me, right? Because medicine is the one place, science is the one place where we hope for objective, non-politicized decision making, but the government's been encouraging politicized decision making, and it's been seeping down into the medical community, into medical journals, such that there is a strong movement that medicine should be racialized. That if we have a white patient and a black patient in the emergency room, that we should decide that the black person has suffered more indignities and difficulties in life, so to compensate for that, we should take the black person over the white person, which is horrific. I mean, the whole doctors should be sworn to treat. We require the Jewish doctor to treat the dying Nazi, right? The Hippocratic Oath is because doctors must be blind to anything except medical need. That even may be a little bit too extreme for me, that one, but nevertheless. But to start having doctors decide for political or sociological reasons, I think this patient is more important in some way. Now, you could look at things like, well, we want to do outreach for COVID vaccines, and we know people in the African American community are more skeptical, so we'll spend more money on outreach. That's okay. But to then say that we're going to give the vaccine to Africa, we're going to put them first in line. I mean, if you want to talk about the sort of thing, then the long term could cause racial hostility on a scale we haven't seen in this country for a long time, starting to prefer people based on their arbitrarily decided race by the government, who gets medical treatment and who doesn't, and allowing, I would refuse. I mean, if you told me my doctor was doing something like that, I would say this person isn't fit to be in the medical profession. I want him to see me as a patient. I don't even want him to ask me about my race. Do a genetic test. That's cool. See what genetic issues I have that might affect how a weight loss treatment works for me or how a cancer drug. But the fact that I'm white shouldn't really have anything to do with anything.
Yeah. So is your view, I mean, is your view, you're a, you're libertarian leaning in your politics, I mostly libertarian leaning too. Is government particularly, it sounds so ridiculous. Is government particularly stupid when it comes to racial classification? Or is this like, if turn over the rock, this is how sort of everything works, and it's all just stupid?
I mean, racial classifications in some sense are stupid to begin with, in a sense that we now, to the only sense that they would make for most purposes is genetic, is with regard to genetics. But now we have genetic, so it could be a crude proxy for genetics, right? Because the average black person is going to be more genetically different from a white person, the average other white person, right? But that's really crude. Because even within Africa is actually the most genetically diverse continent because humans started there, so they had more time to evolve in Africa. So Africa is the most diverse. So makes much more sense to look at genetics. Now in the U.S., the problem with being completely race blind, as they are in countries like France, is you get into a situation where they refuse to discuss discrimination or against Arab immigrants, against hostility against Jews, because they won't keep the statistics because everyone's just a Frenchman. And they ignore social problems because of that. So that's also an issue. So it makes a certain amount of sense to do what the government tried to do initially, which is to find relatively crude but somewhat useful ways of classifying people to monitor discrimination and to see if there are certain groups that are having certain social problems that may require some sort of intervention. The problem is that all these things wind up, there's no such thing as like rational government policy that we just decide, here's how we use X and nothing else. It all will come down to politics. Once you set these classifications, interest groups will coalesce around these classifications and want stuff. And other groups will say, well, if they're getting stuff, then we want stuff. Or we'll say, well, if they're getting stuff, that's not fair. Take away their stuff, and you wind up with race-based politics, essentially.
So is this so? Doesn't that say something for the French system that maybe that your choices are you do it badly or you don't do it at all because if you start collecting this data, it's going to lead to calls for intervention and government's never going to do this stuff well.
Yeah, I mean, one problem is that we have certain civil rights laws in the U.S. that have to be enforced. Now, you can argue that we don't really need certain interpretations of the laws wouldn't require collective data. Just we could go to individualized discrimination rather than look at disparities. But certain laws, like the Voting Rights Act, require the government to have the data to be able to enforce them.
Yeah.
If you don't have the data, you can't enforce the law. So you either have to give up on enforcing certain kinds of anti-discrimination laws, which I don't think the country is prepared to do at this point, or you have to collect some data somehow, right? So there is that issue, but you can collect certainly more finely tuned data. You could not consider immigrants from Africa to be the same as the great-grandchildren of sharecroppers. You certainly don't have to consider all Latin American immigrants to be of the same exact culture, race, and everything else when they have wide disparities in religion and how they look and what their physiological background, anthropological background is. You certainly don't have to consider 60% of the world population from Pakistan all the way to the Philippines to be members of the same group. And you could also, one thing I suggest in the book is to the extent we want not just civil rights enforcement, but remediation, it would make a lot more sense to use what is at least arguably a non-racial classification. Say, you know what? American Indians who live on reservations, right? Not people who happen to be members of the Cherokee tribe, even though the last person who was full-blooded Cherokee lived in 1830 and they haven't lived on the reservation since then, and they look white and and are of white culture in every other way. People live on reservations. African Americans were descendants of slaves, not Kamala Harris or Barack Obama, but people who are actually descended, who suffer from Jim Crow and so forth. We could remediate that based on political classifications. Descent from someone who was enslaved in the United States, resident of an Indian reservation, right? That would allow for remedial affirmative action without it being essentially race-based. So someone who's an immigrant from Africa, no. Someone who's 164th, or even there's someone in the United States who's 1,284th, I believe it is, Cherokee, but who's a member of the Cherokee tribe. Okay, you're a member of the tribe, but no one owes you anything based on that one great-great-great-great-grandparent. So you could do that as well. I'm not saying whether you should or not is another question. But I think besides government being besides race classifications being especially arbitrary in many ways, race is an especially dangerous classification. It's true that we have other sorts of preferences in society based on, let's say in college, based on geography, based on wealth. We don't normally have riots and massacres and genocides based on some certain other kinds of differences. Religious differences and racial differences are the two ones that seem to cause actual violence and of a massive level and societal disruptions. That's why in the book I eventually say, maybe we should be considering, with maybe a few exceptions, the separation of race and state. The way we've largely evaded large-scale religious conflict in the United States, in a very religious country with very differing views on religious matters, is through some sort, not a full separation, but largely a separation of church and state, and maybe separating race and state would similarly allow people to identify how they want, celebrate their own culture, form their own cultural groups, but not have the government be doling out things one way or the other based on your racial heritage.
Yeah, and I think that's the sort of the originalist textualist interpretation of 14th Amendment, right? I think that's basically what you would get. It's not a radical idea. That's something we could get court cases saying stuff like this, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things that I found in writing the book is when I started writing the book, I felt people on the right or libertarians or whatever may really like this book. People on the left are going to hate it. And the reason they're going to hate it is that even though the book is not about affirmative action, it does call into question some of the underlying assumptions of affirmative action about how we classify people. And I think that since affirmative action is fairly unpopular in the country and is always under threat, they feel like any attack on affirmative action, even indirect, any weakening, you may collapse the whole house. But interestingly enough, since I started the book, I mentioned earlier, there's this question, well, should white Cuban Americans who are sort of culturally similar to their Italian, Jewish, German, whatever, descendant neighbors in South Florida, should they really be considered a minority group? And maybe we should get rid of this whole idea of people of color. Maybe because after all, African Americans and Native Americans have a really different history than other than immigrant groups since 1965. Maybe we should call it BIPOC instead. Black, indigenous, either and people who are people of color, or people of color, or people of color, but Black, indigenous are really the key, and the others aren't as significant. And maybe for that matter, we shouldn't refer to African Americans as one single group anymore. Maybe we should separate out ADOS, American descendants of slaves, from African immigrants and Jamaican and Caribbean immigrants who are taking up a good percentage of the affirmative action slots in universities and elsewhere. Now, after all, they didn't suffer from Jim Crow and slavery in the United States. They're taking compensation or remediation that belongs to us. So this has actually become a really live issue on the left as well. So I'm hopeful that even people who aren't against affirmative action or think that government needs to be race neutral will consider the arbitrariness of our government, of our current classifications, and whether there's a better way of doing things.
Yeah. But it's maybe the left. It seems to make perfect sense, even from a left wing perspective, that you want to single out the American descendants of slaves. The thing is, but maybe I think that maybe they are being rational and think that if you critique this thing at all, the whole house of cards will collapse, because you have these multiple dangers. You have public opinion, which once you start I think the strength of the affirmative action, the race classification system, is it's so vague. We don't really say we're giving people's preferences. We just say we care about diversity. We don't say quota. We say there's a disparate impact. You can't have a test that has two groups. So this stuff is so unpopular that you need these games to be able to get away with it, and for institutions to do these things. And once you start making explicit what you're going, okay, group X, you're going to get Y preference. You're going to get a certain amount of points, and you're going to give it for exactly this justification, not some vague thing, general diversity. It's actually a redistributionist model aimed at specific people for specific reasons. The conservative justices just find it easier to throw that out. Public opinion finds it easier to just, vote against that. And then the whole thing collapses. You don't get racial preferences at all. I think there was a liberal writer, Jonathan Scheidt, who said something like this, the affirmative action system is irrational, but the alternative is not, some kind of thing in the middle. The alternative is no affirmative action, no race-based policy. So might that be a dilemma that, liberals face?
Sure, and I think their initial instinct of including Hispanics and Asians in a lot of these programs was to have a broader coalition, so that it would be easier politically than we're not just helping African Americans, we're helping all minority groups. They have a bigger coalition. There's diversity aspect to it, and so forth. But the difficulty becomes that at some point, if the vast majority of people who are getting government contracts for affirmative action are not African American at all, and that was the intent, was to help African Americans. And if, for example, in colleges, especially at the most elite schools, there was a study. It was almost 20 years ago already, that at Harvard University, of the Black undergraduates, 2/3 were just either immigrants, the children of immigrants, or had one white parent. And this is also becoming an issue that people with one white parent, with one African American parent, tend to do much better in a variety of metrics than African Americans themselves. But of course, they have the advantage of having the white parent. So at some point, if your goal was to especially aid African Americans and maybe the sort of American Indians who live on poor reservations and are isolated. And it turns out the people who are being helped are almost entirely post 1965 immigrants of all races, and not the people who help you. Okay, you're fighting to preserve this, but what are you fighting to preserve? You're fighting to preserve arbitrary benefits from people who did not suffer historical discrimination in the United States. And then the only reason you're doing it is because you think these people will still be your political allies. And it's true and that's maybe true to some extent, because they do still tend to vote on the liberal side, which is where the activists lie. On the other hand, you see that with issues, the people who are, I think one reason I think that Hispanics have been changing their voting patterns is that they were upset with the riots in 2020 that the media sort of didn't really cover, but there was massive destruction in cities across the country, and many of the neighborhoods that were under attack, the small businesses, were owned by Hispanic immigrants, and the police said, "Oh, sorry, Black Lives Matter. We shouldn't. They're mad at us. We can't come and protect you." And crime rates have shot up in throughout the country and so forth. And a lot of African Americans themselves aren't interested in the woke agenda, but there's still a certain amount of solidarity within the African American community for obvious historical and current reasons. But Hispanic immigrants are like, well, this is ridiculous. We need law. We can't abide the absence of law and order in these in the neighborhoods that we're building up in these cities.
Yeah. Yeah. If I was going to guess and say sort of what's the motivation for, still wanting affirmative action, even if it doesn't go to ADOS, as you call them, American descendants of slaves, I think it's an aesthetic preference. I think there's a lot of people, maybe not just liberals, but some moderates and conservatives too. They see leadership in the country. It's too many white faces. It's just scary. They don't care where those black faces come from. They don't care what they've been through. Just give me some dark faces to
Right.
throw in there, and I feel.
Although again, we have to remember that the way who is one of the so we can have someone like the Secretary of Defense, whose name I'm blanking on.
Lloyd Austin.
No, he was.
Mark Esper. Esper, the Lebanese guy with Trump.
I'm thinking of the guy now. He's like an Argentine Jew or something, for Ashkenazi Jew, but he was also Cuban. Miarchus.
Yeah.
So he's trumping as like the first Latin American, whatever. You see the Secretary. I should know who's the Secretary. Blinken's the Secretary of State. He's Secretary of Defense.
The Department of Homeland Security.
Homeland Security. There we go. Sorry, I as a libertarian, I try not to.
to know their names. Yeah.
I try not to pay too much attention to this stuff. But anyway, so he was the first, Hispanic, whatever. But then in the Trump administration, they had two half Lebanese. Is Esper and also Alex Azar, who happens to be my law school classmate, whose dad is Lebanese, identifies as Lebanese. He wears actually the ring of his Christian Lebanese ancestor, who was like the prince of whatever little principality before the Ottomans drove them out. So he's Lebanese, but they're just sort of arbitrarily deemed by whoever to be white, and Miarchus is deemed arbitrarily to somehow be a minority. So yes, there's an aesthetic preference, but it's this weird aesthetic preference where we arbitrarily decide.
No, but they don't care. If Marcos or Esper went away, they don't care. It's blacks they care about. I mean, they want to see some dark face. You'll get close enough. You'll get some people who look, could pass for white, but you have some black people, and then you have some people who are ambiguous, and everyone's comfortable. That's what they want. They want just that comfort. It's like a commercial where you have two white people and a black person. You just feel uncomfortable. You don't care where.
Well, I think I actually, I've thought about this for a long time, and I'm very uncomfortable with any sort of race preference, but I have some sympathy with the notion that, with regard to African Americans in particular, decreasingly so, but still, that there's historically been, and still to some extent, there's sufficient social isolation that powerful institutions to some extent should have someone black there to be saying, hey, you're you're not thinking about us as full citizens. You don't really interact with us. Here's how this is going to affect our community that you're not aware of. Right. Because it's changing, but as recently as like 30 years ago, let's say, there was almost no interracial marriage between blacks and whites in the United States, 5% or something for blacks, which made it even lower for whites too. And there was a lot of residential segregation. And I don't think universities are doing anyone any favors by actually furthering segregation intentionally, having separate graduations and separate dorms and all that. But there is this segregation where you can imagine that, hey, we want to have a place at the table to point out things that you might not be aware of because you don't socially interact with people like us so much. I think there is something to that. But the less isolated the group is, the less segregated they are, the less likely they are, the more likely they are to have relatives and friends of different groups, the less likely there's any particular reason why they should have representation specifically in elite circles. There's no particular reason why, like if you're in Florida, that a Cuban American has to be in the cabinet in Florida. Cuban Americans are a politically powerful group. They have a lot of authority in both parties. They're more Republicans, but a lot of them are also Democrats. They're not socially isolated. They intermarry at high rates. So it's not, you certainly don't want to exclude people. And it's nice to have different perspectives, but why would it be more important to have, say, a Cuban American from Florida than someone who grew up in a trailer park, in an isolated rural neighborhood? In Florida somewhere, right? Those people really don't get much representation. No one really thinks about them very much.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're more optimistic about than I am about being able to sort of have this middle ground. Like you have even if blacks are socially isolated, to have a person there who speaks for the black community, how do you stop that from turning into a grift? How do you stop that from just, that person being having a political agenda? Like who's to say that he actually represents the
No,
views
I
of the
mean,
majority or what's good for that group
like I said,
or yeah.
I'm uncomfortable uh, with it in a variety of levels, but I think but I see the logic of the argument. Is as far as I'm not going to endorse it or not endorse it. I'm just going to say I can see the logic of saying that there's been a group that's been sort of the out group. Similarly, one could imagine, in India saying, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have all Brahmins running the university, right? We should make sure we have an untouchable. I don't know all the caste of India, but so to the extent, so the only two groups I think in the United States that we could fairly say were subject to a caste system historically were Native Americans on reservations and African Americans. And of course, the caste system in both regards has been declining and over time, and maybe it's too late to really remediate it in any meaningful way. But again, I can see the logic of saying that those groups, uh, uh, we want them to have some sort of representation, but not to sort of arbitrarily pick out people. Oh, well, your ancestors spoke Spanish, so therefore, like, well, what about the people whose ancestors spoke Greek or Arabic or German or Polish or Armenian or any other language? Why arbitrarily do we decide that Latinos are the only ethnic group that need representation?
Yeah, yeah. So that mean Tom Sowell has written about the affirmative action for castes in India, and yeah, I mean it sort of supports the idea that it's there's no way to do this well because it's just as big of a mess as ours is, and so there might be just a tendency here that you sort of have to choose one thing or the other.
Yeah,
Um,
all the research on affirmative action throughout the world suggests that it never decline.
yeah,
It never gets smaller. It always expands for obvious political reasons. Like I said,
yeah.
once one group gets stuff, other groups
Yeah,
want it.
and so
So I'm
that's the
arguing,
argument for just killing it. I mean, that's the
right.
argument for you just you can have
So,
this.
so I'm arguing that it'd be okay in my view to have a middle ground where we use non-racial proxies for like for certain groups of African Americans or Native Americans. But the point that perhaps it's inevitable that once you have anything like this, once you deviate from strict equal protection, where government cannot classify anybody by anything and give them a preference, that it's inevitably going to decline into a political war of all against all. I mean, that's a fair point. I'm not gonna argue that's not a potentially valid critique.
Yeah, and speaking of Native Americans, we didn't even get to the part of your book about the children of Native American descent. I mean, the laws here that basically, if a kid has this is amazing. If a kid has some Native American ancestor, the government just sometimes just will swoop in and take them and put them into like these, the tribal system, even if they've been adopted, even if the other parent doesn't care. You just talk, this will be the last thing we talk about. You talk a little bit about the sort of this stuff because this chapter of your book just blew me away.
Yeah, so this is an example of a government policy that was well intentioned that went to hell pretty quickly. So there's a history in the United States and in Canada also of the government being sort of insensitive, to say the least, to the mores of local indigenous communities, and at the first sign of any sort of trouble in the family, they would be much more likely to ship the kids off to foster care or a boarding school because their idea was, well, they're in backwards communities anyway, so they'll be better off. And this was obviously grossly unfair to Native Americans to be treated in this manner, to have their kids so much more likely to be taken away under similar circumstances than say white kids were. So Congress passed a law in 1976 trying to remediate this and saying basically that if you have one parent who is a member of a Native American tribe, before they could be adopted or otherwise have the judicial system do anything with them. You first have to ask their tribe whether they want custody of the child before you could give it to, say, a white parent to adopt, or otherwise or if they, and this is really the crazy part, or if you say the child has a Cherokee parent, if the Cherokee tribe says no, it's fine, let the white parent adopt, any other tribe could then adopt the child, could then take custody of the child. And this is pure race discrimination, right? This is like saying, oh, well, if you're an Icelandic child and an Icelandic family doesn't want you, well, a Turkish family could take you because it's the same thing, right? I mean, they're all Indians, like just like these are all Europeans, but they have nothing to do with one another, and they're often enemies historically. In fact, some of these tribes, and a more limited law that said, if both parents are members and retain cultural connections that the tribe has some say, might have been plausible on the political grounds that the tribes are, have their own autonomy and so forth, and these are citizens of the tribes. But just for example, first of all, the parents could have intentionally tried to break off any ties with the tribe, don't want the tribe involved, so why would the tribal rights go ahead of the parental rights? But also, tribal membership could be inherited because, like I said, you could have distant ancestry of inherited membership. So you could have a situation, there was a case like this, in fact, where one parent is 256th member of a certain tribe, the other parent is of European descent. And somehow the tribe gets to decide where the child goes. So the first question is, well, why is the white parents' ethnicity or heritage get downplayed compared to the Indians? But then also, well, they're 256 Native American. They're not really, they've inherited this citizenship, but they have nothing to do. They don't live there. They don't have connections there. Why would that be the main factor rather than our normal factor of best interest of the tribe? So basically, what we have is such a situation is where the corporate interests of the tribe in retaining as many Indian members as they can for political reasons overcomes dramatically, not just a little bit, but dramatically, what would otherwise be considered the best interest of the child and also the parents' own wishes. And that is just really, it really is horrific. I mean, there are these horrific cases where, a kid was fostered by a white mom who had an Indian boyfriend the whole time. The kid has no cultural ties to the tribe, isn't a member of the tribe himself. Only one parent is living with the parents, the white foster parents for 2.5 years. White foster parents want to adopt him, and the tribe swoops in, intervenes, and takes the kid away. And it's just, it's just really horrific stuff. Again, well intentioned initially, but the crazy thing to me is that most law professors who teach Indian law are completely, captured by the woke agenda on this. Not sure why this is woke, but it is. And so, no, this is, of course, we should give the tribe the rights here. Not the kid should just become Indian. I don't really get that.
Yeah, it's absolutely wild. I mean, it was unbelievable stuff. So I recommend people read that chapter and read the whole book, of course. Is there any, before I let you go, David, is there any books, articles on racial classification, American government policy that you'd particularly recommend?
That's a good question. There are a couple of books. There's a guy named John Scrutiny, who's a sociologist at the University of California. I think his work in this area is pretty good. It's more from a sociological perspective. Most of the work is disappointing. You mentioned the book Making Hispanics by Professor Mora. That's a good book. I'll mention the name of my book again because I think we've actually done it for a while. Classified: The Untold Story of Racial Classification in America. You mentioned Thomas Sowell before. I think Sowell is, sort of my guru in the sense that he understands both the arbitrariness of many of the classifications we use, but also that once we use these classifications, there's no society in human history where we have exact horizontal equity between all groups, that different groups, for whatever reasons, have different, wind up doing differently educationally, economically, socioeconomically. They have different cultures and they have different levels of success. And this idea that which I think is behind all of this and is very popular now with some of the intersectional theorists, that everyone would be exactly equal group-wise if we only had the government intervene if there's no discrimination, the government intervene properly, is just nonsense. First of all, you'll never get no society in history has that level of equality, but also how you classify people winds up okay. So when you say all groups should be even, do we divide Native Americans? Do we consider them all as one, or do we then say, well, the Cherokee also have to be exactly equal to the Hopi? And for even for white, one thing we haven't discussed: whites are not a homogenous group either. Americans of Icelandic descent will inevitably have different cultural, economic, etc. attributes than Polish immigrants or Armenian immigrants or Greeks and their descendants and so forth. So I guess the long and the short of it is that we have basically arbitrary classifications, arbitrarily defined, arbitrarily conceived of, that in a lot of ways do a disservice to the public, but also are extremely dangerous politically because they're exactly the sort of things that lead to civil wars. When we divide people up this way, there is a lot of hope based on how people actually behave as opposed to how the government wants them to, that we're moving to uh, a uniracial society where everyone will just be mutt randomly mixed Americans, and that's my hope for the future. And one way of helping to get there would be to have a separation of race and state.
Thanks for being here, David. I enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for having me.